Hello there again, sweet darlings. Long before I seriously started to explore the Catholic faith and the beauty of this church with my husband, I had always been intrigued by the idea of confession. In fact, throughout my years as an atheist, I would joke that although I wasn't religious, if I was to become so, I would be a Catholic, because I liked the idea of confession. But why? As someone who is living a secular lifestyle complete with the drinking, partying, and all the rest, why would confession appeal to me? I think because, even then, from my limited understanding of Catholicism and the premise of confession, I knew that it wasn't something to be afraid of, or something associated with the silly stereotype of Catholic guilt. I think I imagined even then that it was something that would feel good, to unburden yourself and ask for forgiveness, just like a little child does. Now, when I made the decision to enter the Catholic Church at the age of 29, I was faced with the reality that I would actually need to prepare for my first ever confession. And I did start to worry a little bit about what the priest might think of me and my 29 years worth of sins of all sorts. Having to examine such a long period of time was in itself quite difficult. I couldn't remember all of the details, but I knew that there were some major things that I had never considered as bad before, which were in fact mortal sins. Our society today has normalized so many terrible things that I really needed to reframe most of my life ahead of my first confession. For example, being on birth control, something that was so normalized. Having sex before marriage, something that was actually promoted by my own parents. Lying to my friends, lying to teachers, all of those little untruths which I told to cover my own back or make sure that I didn't get into trouble. Wishing for bad things to happen to those who'd hurt me. Wishing to be seen as beautiful, as the best, to be admired, or even put up on a pedestal. Now, what I found to be a real challenge before this first confession wasn't just the 29 years worth of remembering. It was the fact that I knew I couldn't leave anything out. I couldn't let myself off the hook and say, well, it was just one time, or that wasn't really me, so does it count? Thoughts that had passed through my mind that were evil or lustful, did I have to confess those as well? It was so hard to admit even to myself those dark things that I had buried, and I was afraid of saying them out loud. Before my confirmation, I walked across that flagstone floor, feeling clammy all over and with a dry throat. What a life to have lived before asking to enter into such a beautiful church, I thought to myself. I closed the confessional door behind me, and I got out my notes. And I made it through a few sentences before starting to cry. I restarted, and I made it to the end somehow, and then followed my notes again, because I didn't have it memorized, what I was supposed to say at the end for forgiveness. Thank goodness the priest listening to me was a very patient man. He was so gentle with me, and from that confession onwards he has given me such good advice to be peaceful, to trust in God, and to ask Him for all of the graces that I need to be where I am right now, and to do His will in my life. I walked out of that confession lighter. It felt like a real weight was off of my shoulders. And that feeling hasn't changed since. I'm always nervous before I go in, and I wonder as I stand in line, do I really need to admit that to someone? But the answer is always yes. No matter how ugly the thoughts or deeds make me feel, how unworthy of being in that place at all, I have to ask to be forgiven again. And I am. And I come away renewed and hopeful and full of a bit more motivation and grace to do better tomorrow. Although I still sometimes take my notes with me, and I'm often quite nervous about saying those sins out loud, I'm starting to look forward to confession now. I know that I will come away not only having my conscience clear, but having received some good advice just at the right moment, and be ready to start again. There are, of course, recurring issues, and sometimes it's just those little things, being impatient, raising my voice, judging others, lacking faith that God has a plan for me. And other times it's a specific argument, a harsh comment, or thoughts which come out of nowhere, and remind me that although my past sins are forgiven, that life is still trying to weasel its way back into my mind and tell me that it's okay to do those things and have those thoughts. It still seems a bit dramatic to me to say that it's the devil whispering in my ear as I stand in line for confession, suggesting that I just sit down and leave it another week. But who else would it be? If he hasn't managed to stop me going to church, that's his last hope, to stop my connection to God and his forgiveness, and sow the seed in me that those sins are normal, or that they're so small that they don't need to be forgiven. And for a while after I entered the church, he succeeded in making me feel so low and undeserving of God in my life that I didn't want to receive the Eucharist at all. I felt disgusted with myself, but I lacked the strength to get myself into that line for confession and say it out loud. But I did eventually, and I admitted that I'd been avoiding the Eucharist because I'd felt so bad about myself. The priest was kind, of course, and reminded me that it's often when we need God the most that we turn away from him. We need a prayer answered, but we can't get on our knees to ask. We need to be filled up like an empty cup with that life-giving beauty of the Eucharist, but we refuse to accept that sacrifice, and we try to make our best without it. So many people who look at the Catholic faith think that things like confession are restrictive, that they make you feel full of shame and are all about making you feel terrible about yourself. I can honestly say from my experience that I feel terrible when I don't go. I feel terrible being disconnected from that forgiveness that God offers me if I choose to lay it all out and say, "Look what I did." He's never going to refuse to forgive me, and this is the only relationship I will ever have where I can make the same mistake again and again and be forgiven again and again. God, like the most loving Father imaginable, will comfort me, give me grace, and send me right back out there to try again. Knowing that this is how it will go every time I go to confession makes it seem a bit silly, really, that I would avoid going. Even the most perfect parent in the world would struggle to always throw their arms open to catch a child who has, yet again, bitten their sister, told a lie, or refused to do their chores. They would eventually lose patience with that child. But God doesn't do that. If any of you who are watching this are Catholic, and it's been a while since you went to confession, please go when you can. Let it go. Take that weight off your shoulders and pass it over to God. Tell him what you need to do better, and let him know that you can't do this alone. He is always there to give us what we need and wants us all to make it to heaven to be with him. As ever, thank you all so much for tuning into this video. I hope you consider sharing it with a friend or family member and hitting subscribe if you haven't already so that we can visit again soon. I hope to see you all here again soon for the next one, but in the meantime, take good care everyone, and God bless.